Hello everybody and welcome back to a lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and for this lecture we are going to continue right along on our discussion about the ancient Greeks, about the ancient Hellenes. And in our last discussion, we shifted focus from classical Sparta and we began to look at classical Athens. And we saw the development of Athens internally, the development of the democracy. We looked at the careers of men such as Solon, who first initiated the reforms, the reforms that would become the bedrock of the democratic reforms. And Solon was initially commissioned with authority, commissioned with power to come in and reform the economic life of Athens. But he's delved into the political life of Athens as well. And his reforms would not be it. It would be the beginnings of Athenian democracy, but it would not be until the career of Pisistratus, in which many of the democratic reforms were put into place. And Pisistratus did a lot to further that, but even Pisistratus' reign, his 30-year reign, wasn't really enough, and it would not be until the rise in the career of a man named Cleisthenes, and it would be Cleisthenes who would lead the Athenians down the path to true democracy. They would form their own democracy, and his reforms, his social reform, revolutionized Athens and put Athens on the path to imperial power. And this is where we pick up the story with Athens. We pick up the story with Athens, looking at Athens during its imperial phase, and to begin with, let's just say that let's begin by saying that the Athenians benefited almost immediately from the Delian League arrangement, with the member states not contributing men or ships, but making a monetary payment. The Athenians were handed the funds necessary to build their great fleet. They embarked on a great shipbuilding program, and that shipbuilding program domestically enriched Attica. Attica, the home region of Athens. And throughout much of antiquity, Attica is really Athens writ large. And this is true especially after the democratic reforms. Now, the effect of the shipping industry was to turn Athens into the nexus or the focal point of Greek commercial life. The presence of the fleet brought in traders from across the Aegean world, and the growth of Athens' power lay in her fleet. Besides being subsidized by the Delian League, sparking the shipping and shipbuilding industries in Athens, the fleet employed thousands of Athenians. This enabled a very potent link to be formed between the Athenian population, the people of Attica, and their empire, and the thought of maintaining that empire. Had the Athenian citizens had to be enrolled to serve in the fleet, they also were enrolled to serve in distant garrisons, and there were also the men of this fleet, the men of these garrisons that were sent out to collect the tribute from the subject states of the Delian League. And what happened was a simple expansion of power in the Aegean that was reinforced by Athenian institutions. In 460 BCE, a new generation of politicians had come to power in Athens. These politicians were men who began to see Athens as it was defined by the democracy. They began to see this Athens defined by the democracy, defined by the navy, and defined by their empire. They were opposed by the older generation, who were primarily influenced by the Persian Wars and the Athenian experience through those Persian Wars. Remember, Athens itself was burnt to the ground. The city was destroyed by the Persians, but the Athenians sort of spearheaded the two battles that brought god King Xerxes to his knees and precipitated the Persian withdrawal from the Aegean world. Now, those older men, they were influenced by those wars and that experience. In the years that followed the end of the Persian War, men like Cimon, who saw Persia had the enemy and Sparta had the friend, they maintained power. And this line of thinking led the Athenians to send an army under Cimon. In the last lecture, I spoke about the Athenian army that was sent into Sparta that was asked to leave. Cimon controlled that army. Cimon was under commanded army, and Cimon had persuaded the Athenian assembly to send that army into Sparta to help put down that Helot rebellion that had been sparked by an earthquake. Now, the Spartans in 462 expelled the Athenians, and they asked Cimon to leave and take the Athenian army with him. This was a major political blunder for the Athenians. The next year, Cimon was ostracized, and he was asked to leave. And ostracism was simply every year the Athenian assembly would simply vote on whether they should ostracize someone, whether they should ask someone to leave, and if you got enough votes, then you were asked to leave. And the name comes from the ostracon. It was a pottery shard that the names were written on. And Cimon, when he was ostracized, the funny thing with ostracism was that it was a preemptive to simply descending into political violence. When you were ostracized, your property was left intact, your money was left intact, everything that you owned was left intact. It was simply the Athenian state and the Athenian people asking you to leave Athens because they feared you might become a tyrant and try to overthrow the democracy. And so in the name of good order, good public order, you were asked to leave Athens for 10 years. And Cimon was ostracized. He was forced to go into exile. Now, that event began the not-so-subtle transition in Athenian-Spartan relations. With Cimon on the outs, Pericles rose to power in Athens. And Pericles was a younger man, but he was from an old Athenian aristocratic family, and he was unconcerned with Persia. He saw Sparta as the chief rival of Athens in the Greek world. Pericles wanted to maintain Spartan influences, and he wanted to contain those Spartan influences, and he wanted to form a series of alliances with other Greek states in central Greece to sort of form a bulwark of a coalition against Sparta and the Peloponnesian League, the league that the Spartans headed. Now, this led to war between Athens and Sparta, as Sparta saw itself as the dominant power in mainland Greece. The Spartans began to view the Athenian actions as hostile. Now, this war was sporadic. It was a sporadic event, and this was known as the First Peloponnesian War. This was 460 to 446. During this war, the Athenians completed their long walls, a series of walls, long walls that barricaded and protected the city of Athens and connected the city of Athens to her port, the Piraeus. Now, the walls made Athens a city that was impervious to assault as long as she had access to her port and to her fleet. Now, the Athenians, they still supported anti-Persian activities, and between 460 and 454 BCE, they sent aid to an uprising in Egypt. Now, this force was destroyed by the Persians. The Persians met this force in the Nile marshes, and they defeated it. And this defeat had very real consequences, as the subject states of the Delian League almost all rose in unison and to rebel against Athenian domination. Now, this rebellion led the Athenians to decide to remove the treasury of the Delian League. And they removed that treasury and they stored it in Athens. The Athenians began to project their imperial ambition by instituting standard measurements and weights based on their own. And this really cemented their position as the dominant economic power, not only within the Delian League, but within the Aegean Sea region, within what we can largely look at as East Greece. Now, the most visible part of this Athenian imperialism was the building of the Acropolis. The Acropolis was simply the high portion of the city, and the Athenians went on this massive public works program that, one, beautified their city and made it more prestigious, but also put a lot of Athenians to work, as you need the manpower to actually go out and build the public works. And this building program includes the Erection, the Propylaea, and of course the Parthenon, all of which were a part of this great building scheme by the Athenians. Now, all of these were built using the reserve funds of the Delian League, which was given to Athens by the Athenians. So the Athenians, with the funds taken from the collective treasury of the Delian League, they build up their city, and they do this because they themselves give themselves the money. So that's just an insight into the imperialism, the open imperialism, the naked imperialism of the Athenians at this point. Now, the Peloponnesian War, is collectively the most defining moment in ancient Greek history. To quote the author Thucydides, who leaves us really with our best account of the war, it was a war like no other. More than a contest between Athens and Sparta, the Peloponnesian War was an event that divided the Greek world and became the most defining moment in the lives of its participants. The generations that fought this war, they were consumed by this war. This was the moment that everybody looked back to. The war drew in non-Greek peoples, also Macedonians and Persians. Each sought to capitalize on the chaos and to expand at the expense of the Greeks. Now, the decades-long war followed up the Persian Wars. And have we been discussing, Athens rose to a position of leadership. Athens assumed a position of leadership among several Greek polities who sought to form a protective alliance against further Persian aggression. This simple alliance, the Delian League, will propel Athens to the height of imperialism, and it will see Athens impose tribute on the smaller members. And that tribute would lead to the creation of a massive commercial shipbuilding industry, a ship manufacturing industry, and of course a shipping industry. Now, Athens would eventually be checked by the power of Sparta. By the 430s BC, nearly all of the Greek city-states had become allies of either Athens or Sparta. From 431 to 44 BCE, the Greeks experienced a suffering the likes of which they had never seen before. Or at least not within living memory during the classical period. I'm sure worse things happened during the Bronze Age collapse and during the quote-unquote Greek Dark Ages. The end of the war left the Greek world irreparably altered. Athens lost her great power status. Her fleet was destroyed. The democracy was overthrown. The Delian League was disbanded. To say the least, this was a cataclysmic war for the Athenians. To understand this event, we must back up in time to examine the developments in the Greek world that preceded it. Both Athens and Sparta have fought for the Pan-Hellenic alliance against the Persians. Afterwards, they traveled down two different paths. Athens began to embrace imperialism and began using her navy to control the Aegean Sea, and was propelled to great power status by the virtue of the Delian League. Taxing the Delian League and enforcing Athenian rule by breaking revolts, seizing land from rebel subjects, and establishing clericies. And clericies were simply establishments of Athenian citizens. Well, they could be establishments of any Greek city, state, but these were settlements that were established far away, in which the settlement population does not form a new city-state. They do not form a new Greek colony. What they do is they form this settlement, but they retain all their citizenship rights. They can move back to the mother city whenever they want, to the mother polis whenever they want, and they can vote in the elections. So this is a standing body of citizens who are not in the city proper. And that's what the Athenians do. They establish clericies by seizing land from city-states that rebel. The Athenian colonies, they enabled Athens to firmly check the ambitions of suspect city-states. Now, the Spartans, by contrast, are organized along very different lines. Sparta embraced isolationism. They had great contempt for foreign adventures. They also pursued very loose alliances that left members free of direct Spartan oversight. Now, the members of Sparta's alliances, the Peloponnesian League, they didn't pay tribute to Sparta. Every city made contribution to a war chest that every member had access to. The Peloponnesian League was also an army alliance with no maritime interest. The Spartans, again, they're a land force. They're not controlling helots overseas. They're controlling helots in the backyard. So they need a large land force. To be certain, there were members of the Peloponnesian League who had maritime interests, but Sparta wasn't one of them. The Spartans had allies who were, and this is another thing that stands in contrast with the Peloponnesian League and the Delian League. Within the Peloponnesian League, there were allies that were almost as powerful as Sparta herself, like the city of Corinth. Corinth was vastly wealthier. Thebes was also wealthier, and Thebes had great military strength. Corinth, the Corinthians were a maritime people. They were traders, and they control. If you want to look at it at the West Greece, if you want to look at it as the Western Greek world, that's where Corinth's maritime interest lay. And Thebes was a bit to the north and around central Greece. And Thebes was a very wealthy city in its own right, great trade relations, and Thebes also had great military strength. So within the Peloponnesian League, the Spartans were confronted. Within the Peloponnese, I should say, not within the League. The city of Argos was not a true ally to Sparta, and the Argives would at every moment, every interjection, to try to oppose the Spartans. And this went back to a battle long ago in the Greek memory, in which the Argives and the Spartans fought a battle. And the battle ended with one Spartan standing and two Argives standing. The two Argives decided that the battle was over, they had clearly won, and they went home to celebrate the victory. The Spartan stayed on the field, and he held the field until the Argives departed. Afterwards, he raised the trophy, and he returned home. And Sparta refused to acknowledge it as a defeat. They claimed that the Spartan held that numbers alone do not determine the end of battles, and that since the Spartan held the field and the Argives withdrew, they claimed victory for the battle, and they refused to give back the Argives dead until the Argives admitted or accepted Spartan victory. This led to another battle in which the Spartan army decisively defeated the Argive army and rose on to become the dominant power within the Peloponnese. The Argives never forgot that, and at every interjection, at every dealing with the Spartans, they included a clause in all dealings that stipulated that they had the right to challenge the Spartans to battle. They didn't. They wanted to be the #1 city in the Peloponnese. And that sort of basically summarizes the Spartan-Argive relationship. And again, those two are neighbors within the Peloponnese. So Sparta is confronted by a powerful opponent right in her backyard. Now, the outbreak of war, the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War, was accompanied by a shift in Athenian policies following the ostracism of Cimon and the rise of Pericles. And again, we have to remember that Pericles views Sparta, not Persia, as the greater threat to Athens at this point. Upon Cimon's return to Athens in 451 BCE, he was able to persuade the Athenians to refocus their energies on Persia, and he was able to gain command of an expedition to Cyprus, where he died. He died on campaign there. And Cimon's death led to the end of the campaign and the rapid deterioration of Spartan-Athenian relations. The war would break out in earnest in 431, but had a long incubation period. The Greek city-states frequently went to war with one another, and it can be reasonably argued that peace rather than warfare was the exception in classical Greece. The Peloponnesian War brought all of those two great alliances together, and much like the Europeans during World War I, it was just massive destruction for both alliance structures. The Peloponnesian War also had a much larger impact on Greek society than previous war. Thucydides, the author of the greatest surviving contemporary work on the Peloponnesian War, attributes the outbreak of war to the growth of Athenian power and the jealousy of the Spartans. Now, Thucydides, he fought in the Peloponnesian War. He lived to see the end of the war, but he was an Athenian. And in modern analysis of the war, the onus for the conflict, the onus or the blame for the conflict, really is attributed to the city-state of Corinth. Corinth was an ally of Sparta, and really Corinth was the economic hub of the Peloponnese. And again, that's because Sparta is not interested in trade. Sparta is not interested in this exchange. Sparta is closed off. So Corinth assumes this economic leadership within the Peloponnesian League, within the Peloponnese as a region. And again, and Corinth is really well situated to do this. Corinth is located at a critical juncture, at a place, it's really located on what we call the Isthmus of Corinth. It's this thin strip of land that connects the Peloponnese to the rest of Greece. And Corinth is situated there, and that allows Corinth to simply dominate the shipping lanes between the eastern and the western Greek world. Instead of having to traverse the rough waters and the treacherous waters of the Peloponnese, rounding the Peloponnese to get to the western Mediterranean, what ships would do, and they would simply sail into the harbor of Corinth, and they would pay the Corinthians a token fee, and the Corinthians would simply haul the ships the short distance over land, allowing a quick, easy, and smooth transition from the eastern Mediterranean to the western Mediterranean. Very efficient, very efficient, very much a great boon for ships trying to get in and out of the East Greek world. It not only cut down shipping time, but it also eliminated the risk of simply wrecking and possibly drowning, and most definitely losing some of your cargo, maybe all of your cargo. So Corinth is well situated, and Corinth can reap economic benefits from that. Now, in 433 BCE, a conflict broke out between Corcyra and her colony of Epidamnus. Now, the Corcyrans turned to the Athenians for help. The Epidamnians, they turned to Corinth for help, and Corinth was the mother city of Corcyra. So if you can sort of look at this as Corinth is the mother city of Corcyra, and Corcyra is the mother city of Epidamnus. We have all these cities we have two cities tracing their lineage back to Corinth, but one of those cities is breaking and not seeking to deal with the Corinthians. They're dealing with the Athenians, and the Athenian-Corcyran alliance united two of the three largest fleets in the Greek world, which was a clear threat to all maritime city-states like Corinth, who had substantial maritime interests. But Sparta did not. We have to remember that Sparta was closed off, and Sparta did not entertain commercial interests. This move by Athens had far more reaching implications than naval or seaborne commerce. It had geopolitical consequences. To the Athenian Empire or the Delian League, their interest primarily laid in East Greece. They were comprised mainly of the Ionian Greek cities. Corcyra was in the west of Greece, and was situated on the trade route that ran along the western coast of Greece to the southern, or the boot in the heel of Italy, to southern Italy, all the way to Sicily and the Greek cities on the island of Sicily, like Syracuse. Now, to Corinth, a major economic power, and the mother of many of these colonies, a city that had grown very wealthy based off of these relationships, the Athenian Actions and the implications of Athens shifting interest to the Western Greek world, that was a very troubling thought. The Athenians, shortly after the Corcyra affair, they turned their attention to the city, the small city of Potidaea, and they turned to Potidaea, and they ordered the Potidaeans to tear down their city walls and to dismiss their city magistrates. Now, Potidaea was an Athenian ally in the northern Aegean, and Potidaea was another Corinthian colony. The treatment of Potidaea sent open implications that the Athenians were targeting Corinthian colony. They were trying to weaken Corinthian power, and they were doing this as part of an economic policy to become the unchallenged master of the Greek economic world. Potidaea was besieged by the Athenians. The Corinthians sent a relief force of 1,600 hoplites to assist the Potidaeans. The Athenians, however, were able to capture the city before the Corinthian relief army arrived in 430 BCE. this only heightened the hostilities between the Athenians and the Spartans. Now, the next crisis to develop was a crisis that really drew in the Spartans, this was the crisis that they really drew the Spartans, that really sort of awakened Spartan fears and really Peloponnesian fears about Athenian ambitions and sort of highlighted the nature of Athenian aggression. The next crisis was the Megarian decree. And this was a decree passed by the Athenians that barred the city of Megara, which laid in between Athens and Corinth, from entering Athenian markets or any port of the Delian League. The Megarian decree was an attempt to coerce the Megarians through economic pressure to join the Delian League, where they would have to pay tribute to Athens for the right to trade in the Aegean. Now, the Megarian decree was an attempt to use an embargo policy in a trade war to isolate an opponent and to lock down an economic sphere of influence in the Aegean world, in the Aegean Sea, and in the Saronic Gulf, the area that surrounds Athens. Now, this was troubling for the other powers, because if the Athenians could be allowed to dictate this type of policy to Megara to force a city to join their league by compulsion, they could do it anywhere, to any Greek city. This was a frightening idea to Corinth, but it was a really concerning idea to Sparta, who did not care for trade and focused more on their army. Now, the Spartans were pushed to act by the Corinthians, and in the aftermath of the Megarian decree, Sparta sent an ultimatum to Athens, informing Athens to rescind the order and avoid war. The Athenians, as history will tell us, as history shows us, the Athenians did not agree to that. They did not kowtow to Spartan demands, and the war broke out, and a war between the two great alliance structures, the two great city-states, broke out. Now, the first phase of the Peloponnesian War is known as the Archidamian War, and it gets its name from the Spartan king Archidamus, who led the early Spartan war effort. Though he did so reluctantly, Archidamus didn't really want to go to war with them. He was focused on other military targets. Now, the early phase of the Peloponnesian War saw the Spartan army invade Attica and burn the Athenian crops. Now, the Athenian response to this was to simply pick up their belongings and move out of their homes and resettle in the city of Athens proper. This policy was the defensive policy of Pericles, who reasoned that as long as Athens was protected by her walls, the Athenians would have access, and that the Athenians had access to the sea, they would be impervious to Spartan assaults. Pericles also championed the policy of not trying to enlarge Athens territorially during the war effort. The direction of the war and the future of the policies that Athens would pursue will be interrupted by events in Athens, and namely by two events, one with the death of Pericles and the other with the outbreak of the plague. These events hint at the breakdown of civic and social order, civic leadership and social order in Athens during the course of the war. We will break here, and we will come back, and when we come back in our next lecture, we will continue our look into the Peloponnesian War, and we will look at the new commanders, the new people who arrived to leadership in Athens and in Sparta after King Archidamus and after Pericles. As always, hit like, subscribe, and comment, and let me know what you thought about this lecture. And I'm Ted, and I will see you guys next time for another lecture.